Great. I am now recording.
Awesome.
Um, cool. So let's try this again. I guess Reese, since you're streaming, do you want to do the honors?
Oh, absolutely. Well, welcome to my podcast. Um, my first guest today is my only guest today is Nathan Mays. Nathan Mays is a local composer and bassist. He is also an adjunct professor of music at San Jacinto College and Lone Star College. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Reese, I'm glad to be here. Reese, I really want to just say thanks for having me on today, and that this was not thrown together at the exact last minute, and that I did not frantically ask you last night to help me out with any of this. That did not happen at all. Um, totally planned, all of it. I mean, because clearly this is your podcast, musicians drinking coffee. So here I am drinking coffee.
Oh yes, yes, and I have water. I missed the memo on that.
It's okay. It is your podcast. So,
Yeah,
uh,
psych. It's actually Nathan's.
I know, right? Reese is just the one live streaming it. So, it's good.
Yeah.
So, to actually get on track here, the whole point of this is since all of my classes essentially now are being rewritten, we could say, in an online format. You know, there's a lot of professors right now that have to kind of go and create new types of material. And I yesterday actually saw Reese. He was streaming. I'm assuming it was your podcast, right? Your regular podcast.
It actually was not. I was just doing a one-off
Yeah.
presentation on the history of saxophone, just
Right.
for fun, because I
Yeah.
had
Why
nothing else
not?
to do.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, so I saw him doing this, and it just kind of gave me this idea to, reach out to musicians, people that I went to school with, uh, you know, people who have different areas of expertise, and just kind of talk to them about music and get their thoughts, and use this for my actual classroom. I really think that this is an idea that could catch on, because I know that whenever I learned the most, it came from actually conversing with people. And as I said earlier, as much as I love lecturing, I'm pretty sure my students they get a little tired of hearing my voice. Sometimes I feel like I'm talking at them as opposed to them. And I really just hope that this is a way to kind of mitigate all of that. Um, so we definitely tried this a little earlier and had a horrible, horrible failure. I'm pretty sure on my end. However, I'm just going to try this again. So essentially, kind of where I left off with my class, I guess, is we had just began the classical era, and one thing that I really focus on in my class is form. I think form is really important for music and just the progression of it. Um, and when I say form, I essentially am talking about like a formula for writing music. You know, in the classical era, we get this one type of form that really takes over called the sonata allegro form. And the basis of this thing is that it comes in three parts, although I'm pretty sure they were thinking in terms of two parts, the first part and the second part. For us, with our modern eyes, we look at it in three big parts: what we call the exposition, the development, and then the recapitulation. And one thing that I've really harped on with my class at the moment is this idea of the exposition. And if you really look at an exposition of a story or a TV show, even an academic paper, anything that you write, the exposition really sets up just the basics of everything, right? Like, these are the characters, this is the setting, this is the mood of everything. That's all set up in the exposition. And in music, it's really similar because so far in my class we've talked about a fugue and the sonata allegro form. And one thing that really sort of resonates with them, it seems, is that in the exposition, that's all the material that you're going to hear. Or at least that resonates with me. Like, all the material that you're going to hear for the entire piece of music is presented right here in the exposition. And then the rest of the piece is how they use that material. Um, well, one more quick thing, I guess. It's like when you're writing a paper, the very first part is your introduction. It's like, here is what I'm going to say, right? And then you have the body of your paper. Here is what I am saying. And then you have the closing of the paper, which is basically, here's what I've just said. And like that is essentially sonata allegro form. The exposition, here's what I'm saying. The development, here's what I'm doing with all of that material. And the recap or the recapitulation, like here's what I've just said. So I don't know. Any thoughts on that as a classical saxophone player?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. You know, the amount of orchestral uh, literature that saxophonists are allowed to participate in is somewhat limited by history. But
Mhm.
um,
Well, to be fair, at this point in history, your instrument didn't quite exist yet. However,
that
I still think that you have a very valid viewpoint on like how this stuff unfolds.
right, sure, and that's a good point as well. But yeah, I think your comparison to like writing a paper is spot on. Um, you know, I remember when I was younger, before I had really kind of gone through my music classes and really kind of started to understand the whole formula behind classical music. I actually found it. I almost found the structure of it boring in a way because it kind of sounded like the same thing over and over again. And I know that a lot of people who are not familiar with this music will probably feel similar because the aesthetics of it are not modern. It's harder to focus on. You can't look at it the same way, right? So like this would be like, I guess, to kind of build off your comparison, this would be like telling somebody who just is really really in to it would be like trying to get somebody who's really into science fiction to read an academic paper on
Sure.
some different subject, right? And so not only is the content different, but the structure is different,
Mm.
and the tone is different, right? I feel like, to me, the interesting thing about sonata allegro form is the form, and the form, like you
I
said, the
agree,
formula
actually.
of it. And the thing I was going to say before your iPad exploded was that if I really feel like, and this is like the most memeish thing I could say
Hmm.
ever, but I feel like if you were to compare pop music and classical music, then Taylor Swift is Beethoven.
That okay. That's kind of controversial though in a way. I have my own thoughts on who Beethoven would be in a pop world. I'm curious
Right.
why. What you said, Taylor Swift?
Yeah. Yeah. Because um, well, maybe actually, no. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, that is not a very good comparison.
Uh, see, I
So
I
then
would
Taylor
say
Swift would be
like
more like
Haydn. I
Haydn.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I was thinking about the right thing, but I said the wrong name.
Right. I
Um,
understand. I understand.
because she does the exact same thing formulaically
Right.
every single time, right?
Right.
And when you talk to, especially when I talk to younger students who are in like a music appreciation class, who have listened to Taylor Swift, they know all the terminology. They know like, oh yeah, this is a chorus. Oh yeah, this is
Exactly.
pre-chorus. This is bridge. This is the final chorus with her going over the top of it,
Right.
right? And or some people call that an outro, or
Yeah.
something
Right.
like, or
It's
a conclusion. I don't know.
post
Uh,
chorus, like
Post
whatever you.
chorus,
Yeah.
okay. But it's so like, but the thing about her is like, it's like I almost wonder if we're starting to witness like history repeating itself,
Oh
and
yes.
but much quicker because pop music is so like
It's so
like
formulaic.
well, it's so formulaic, but at the same time, it moves so fast because every
Sure.
every single pop artist wants to do like the next big thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
So like I guarantee you, if you like just like cut pasted Billie Eilish like 10 years ago, nobody would like her.
Oh, I have no doubt about that.
She would be considered indie,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or maybe not even that.
Well, I mean, remember when like Skrillex first came around? You
Oh yeah,
like the whole concept of dubstep was very underground, and now those sounds are so mainstream. And this was what, 5, 6 years ago, 10 years ago at most. Like,
Not even. Yeah.
yeah, and like now it's like you can't find a pop song without those sort of like harsh dubsteppy sounds. Even in like country music of all things, you know. Um, I recently last year sometime I went to a lecture by a guy named Doug Romanoff, I think it's Romanoff. Um, he was sort of this like Canadian producer. He's worked with like Bieber and Drake and all the, I guess, the A-list Canadian celebrities. But
Mm.
one thing that he was saying is that every style of popular music, like every style now, is about 90% generated just from a guy on a computer, you know? And the concept of like instruments actually being involved in pop music is kind of few and far between. And um, country music was kind of like the last bastion of like a group actually getting together to record something. And however, like now it's even in that style, it's all kind of these synthetic sounds, a guy on a keyboard, um, and it's it's all extremely formulaic, you know. Um, Something that I harp on with my class a lot is the form of a pop song. It's pretty much always going to be verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus, some form of that.
Right.
Um, and it always reminds me of this video that I watched. I think I showed it to my class. You might actually get a kick out of it. I don't know. It might be a little too racy, maybe, but it's Kyle Gass and Dave Grohl, and they're basically, I mean, it's a facetious kind of thing, a parody, but Kyle is interviewing Dave Grohl basically about how to write a hit song, and Dave Grohl sort of jokingly says, he's like, "Oh, just don't write a verse, a chorus. It's all chorus," and he kind of lists through all the songs that everyone knows the chorus to. It's like
Mm-hmm.
Janie's got a gun. Like, what's the actual verse to that? No one knows, but Janie's got a gun,
Right. Yeah.
and like, I mean, that's the joke of the whole video. And he says at one point, the deep cuts don't keep the mansion rolling, and it's like, that's like way too real, man. Like, that's probably a whole other topic in its own right. But I think to kind of tie it back together into this classical form, there's a reason that guys like Haydn saw like way more success in his lifetime than Mozart. Because for instance, Mozart and Haydn, they basically live at about the same time, and Mozart did die way earlier than Haydn did. But Haydn in his lifetime saw way more success than Mozart did. And history kind of proves that Mozart was the better composer in a way. But
Right.
like what they were actually doing in that time, you know, Haydn would have been considered like the sellout in a way, right? Whereas Mozart was like the guy who was the poor starving artist, like quite literally the poor starving artist. And you know, I think that there was a reason for them doing this thing, right? Because Haydn essentially he wasn't writing the deep cuts, right? I mean, he was writing like music to keep the mansion rolling, Like he had like a family to worry about. I don't know how many kids he had, right? But he worked for the Esterhazy family for like his entire career, and they
Right.
took good care of him. But also at the same time, it's like, hey, Haydn, write this string quartet, great, string quartet number whatever. And I think that because music was seen as this sort of like leisurely kind of pastime, you know, um, it really incentivized composers and sort of musicians to create like an industrial way of creating this stuff, because it's like they had deadlines, just like we do today. And like, granted, I feel like the punishment for not creating a piece of music or art within the deadline was probably way more severe back then. you know like, human rights are a thing now. I don't know.
Well, and let's not forget, like Haydn, for example, working for the Esterhadys. If he, I'm sure if he missed, I'm sure if he started missing deadlines, then he was out of a job, and there were,
Right.
there were people, like I'm sure there were people in line, right? Who were just waiting, and because that was a good gig, and
Right,
that's one
right.
thing that hasn't changed, right? We think about the good gigs, so to speak, these days are
Sure.
mainly in academia. If you're talking about teaching and composing,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and uh, so like once you get that gig, you pretty much are going to do just about anything you can do to hang on to it, unless it's like
Right.
really really bad, and you'll put up with a lot, right? And that's
Yeah.
just speaking realistically. Um, and so I think you're absolutely right. Mozart was not a composer who was necessarily concerned with that kind of stuff, and it's kind of interesting because Mozart ends up being, in terms of like a broad historical sense, kind of like the last of the classical composers in a way,
Yeah, right.
one of them,
Right, yeah,
and
right.
and then that brings us to Beethoven, right?
Yeah.
Who, depending on who you ask, he's either the end of the classical period or the bridge to the romantic,
Right.
possibly both. Um, and you know, I find Beethoven's symphonies far more interesting,
Oh, yeah.
and the reason for that is because there's this shift, right? There's this
Yeah.
shift in what the symphony means, and that's really what Beethoven changed.
I agree 100%. And I think that had Mozart lived longer, I feel like Beethoven's music would have been vastly different than what it was, because it's almost that like Beethoven's early music is kind of an extension of what Mozart was doing at the end of his life. Because like symphonies number 40 and 41, those last two symphonies, like they are nothing like anything else anybody was writing at that time. Um, and Mozart was still kind of encapsulated by this whole idea of like classical form, or what we today think of as classical form, because that was just the popular style of the time. But I think what really sets those pieces apart from other things that he wrote, at least to me, is that there's something really visceral about those pieces. There's like an emotional connection that Mozart had with that music, that is, to me, just vastly different from anything else that he had done. um, Even like his operas, they're like, it's almost like cotton candy in a way. But then like those last few pieces that he writes, there's something really different about them. Like it's like he was finally trying to say something in a way. um I guess, from like the composer's viewpoint of these things, um Mozart's music just seems to be like he was trying to do a little bit more than like just write music. He was trying to do something just a little bit deeper. And I really believe that had Mozart been able to live longer, Beethoven's music would have been vastly different. Because again, to me, I feel like Beethoven's early music is just an extension of what Mozart was kind of doing in a way. And I mean, that's probably a controversial statement to somebody, but that's just the way that I've been able to view it, I guess.
Well, and the thing about that is you're speaking in a historical context. Obviously,
Sure.
the content of those symphonies are going to be different, and we're not saying that Beethoven necessarily stole ideas from
Oh,
Mozart. What we're
sure.
what we're saying is that the intention and the purpose behind the music at the end of Mozart's life and at the beginning of Beethoven's symphonies, or the idea behind them, the
Right.
motivation is very similar, right?
Yes, I can agree with 100%.
Yeah, and
Uh,
and Beethoven, of course, as we all know, and as your students are learning in your class, would go on to do some really impressive things and kind of break
yeah.
some of the molds that had been set by composers like Haydn, who just spat out
Right.
symphony after symphony after symphony. So it was almost like, Haydn like created the formula, Mozart, used the formula and kind of started to change it, and then Beethoven said,
Right.
right,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Uh, and to be fair, Haydn didn't quite create the formula. However, that's how one of the biggest contentions I have with like this class is the way that this book kind of sets things, I guess. Uh, but that's neither for here nor there, I guess. But you know, it's important to note that these ideas, they had been bubbling for quite a while in a historical sense, because like the idea of a fugue, for instance, it has a form, right? But the Baroque forms were extremely uneven, whereas in the classical era, things get highly symmetrical, I think is a good way to say it. Um, Everything had to sort of equal something else. It's almost like music at this time becomes like an algebra equation. It's like whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side in order to balance it out.
Right, and you
Um,
start seeing that in terms of like the phrase, like you said, it gets a lot more even. So like the
right,
phrasing, you can almost like bet it's going to be a 4-bar phrase or an 8-bar phrase,
right,
right? Or
right,
some combination of eights and fours, right? And then maybe if they're feeling a little extra, they pepper in like 2 measures of transition,
yeah,
right?
right, right.
But it's but
Well,
it's but it's almost rarely is it 1 measure of transition. It's still an even number.
right, and something I think that's really important to note is that for Mozart and Haydn, the thematic material was way more important than how you develop that material, right? For Beethoven changes the game by saying that essentially the transitions and the development are what's more interesting than the thematic material, right? Beethoven kind of, to me at least, comes out and says, you know, it's not so much what notes you choose, but like what you do with those notes. That's what matters. Um, and I think that leaves very long lasting ramifications for music to come. Uh, Plus, also, it just sounds more interesting. Beethoven, you're going to have, I think, a much more interesting time listening to something from Beethoven than listening to something from even Mozart or Haydn. I personally find that music way more interesting, um, and it's more engaging, I think.
Right. So let's talk about what Beethoven did with the formula then. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on it, since you're a composer. I think you're a little more um, coming at it from the form side than I'm
Right.
coming at it from the history side. But like for example, my understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding is that that the third movement of the symphony wasn't really a scherzo um,
Right.
until Beethoven was really like, you know what, I'm going to do a scherzo, and then everyone was like, oh, okay, sure.
Oh yeah, no, okay. Well, Beethoven did it, sure. Well, let's talk about that for a second. So, for my music appreciation students, let's just kind of line out the movements of a symphony real quick. Um, the basic first movement of a symphony is almost always going to be in an allegro tempo of some sort. Allegro meaning just quick. It's a quick pace. It's not fast, right? Because that would be like presto or vivace, right? But allegro, which is quick, and it can be more or less quick, right? But it's quick nonetheless. And then that's always contrasted with a second movement, which is slow or just slower, right? It's not as fast as the first movement. And then they get to the third movement, right? And the third movement is sort of the trick, I guess you could say, right? Because the third movement was always in a triple meter of some sort, meaning that you could feel it in some form of 3 pulses, right? Either in a compound 9 meter, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? Or just straight 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Sorry for my little pause there. Um, but some form of that triple meter, right? And it wasn't too fast, but it wasn't too slow either, right? And if you think about, who's that character from How I Met Your Mother? Barney, Neil Patrick Harris's character.
Yeah, Barney Stinson.
Yeah, Barney Stinson. There's one episode where he talks about the perfect playlist and the perfect playlist to like hype you up, right? And his whole theory was that you had to start big and then keep going, right? And it's like, in a way, what these composers were doing with these symphonies was trying to create that sort of like hype. The first movement, it hits you, right? It's like, it's fast. Sorry, it's not fast, it's quick, right? So it sort of hits you a little hard, right? And they slow down with the second movement. You got to pull things back a little bit. And then it starts to ramp up again with the third movement. right? And then the last movement was fast, right? It was fast because you got to end with a bang, right? You got to end with some sort of like big thing, you know? And I think what Beethoven does with the third movement is really interesting because Mozart and Haydn, they would have written this sort of triple minuet and trio form, basically, right? Minuet and trio, meaning that it's you basically have this sort of A section that kind of gets repeated a few times, and you move to a different thing, the trio, right? And then it goes back to the minuet. So it's a really large scale kind of ABA form. Um,
Right, and just to point out the difference between a minuet and trio and sonata form, which also
right,
has three parts,
right.
is that there's not a development.
Exactly. Right, right. In the sonata allegro form, right, they have the exposition where they set up all the material, the development where they develop all the material, and then the recap where they basically restate all the material. In minuet trio form, it's here is a section, here is a different section, completely different section, here is that first section again, right? So they don't utilize the material in the same way that you would have in sonata allegro form. Now, what Beethoven does with that, though, is really interesting because, well, first off, can you enlighten us to what scherzo, sort of a rough translation of scherzo means, if you
Yeah.
remember?
So, yeah, way to put me on the spot.
I know, right?
Um, my understanding of scherzo is that it's almost like kind of like a joke,
Right,
right?
exactly.
So like there's typically going to be something about the scherzo that is either unexpected or I don't know, like maybe like a jump scare in a horror movie or something,
Right.
or like a or sometimes it is written in three, but you don't always feel it in a three,
Right.
and you're
It
not
feels in
totally
like one
sure.
or two or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's typically something about a scherzo that just is kind of off just a
Off.
little
Yeah,
bit.
exactly. Now, I think the very first scherzo that I remember encountering was when we were at Sam and when Caratine became our orchestra director, and we played Beethoven's First Symphony. And if I remember right, I believe that was a scherzo in the First Symphony. I think I can't remember now, but I'm pretty sure that that was a scherzo. By the time that Beethoven was writing symphonies, he had already kind of tweaked these formal ideas quite a bit. Um, but I just remember, oh no 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 no, we played the Eroica. That's what it was. Um, anyway, I remember encountering that third movement and just thinking like, what is happening right now? Like what is going on? Because it almost seemed that like it was so different from everything else that we had played up to that point. It was completely unexpected. Which that was whole Beethoven. That was Beethoven's whole shtick, right? Was that here's this thing that you don't expect. You know, here's all this stuff that you expect. Here's this one thing that's a surprise that you don't expect, and then it kind of normalizes again. Uh, yeah, that was always kind of what Beethoven said to me, at least, was that here's surprise, gotcha, in a way.
Right, and then it's like you can't resist once he makes that change and it sticks.
Yeah.
And then so you have. I was actually kind of reading up on Beethoven yesterday because you were like, "Hey, you want to talk about Beethoven?" And I was like, "Sure, I should probably read
Read
about him."
up on Beethoven. Yeah.
But I think either his fifth or his sixth symphony has four movements. One of or has five movements or three or something.
Uh,
Like there was one.
I think it's the last symphony. No,
I don't know. I'm gonna
I
look
think the
this up.
last symphony has four movements. Yeah, I want to look it up too now.
Um,
Or five movements. I mean, symphony.
yeah, they obviously all have four movements.
Right.
Um, but but yeah, but and the obvious symphony to point to is of course his last symphony, the ninth, right?
Right. Right.
Where he adds choir, and it becomes the first choral symphony. At least the first good one. I've never heard of one before that.
Right.
And so it's almost like once he realizes that he can make these changes to the symphony and be kind of successful, it's like he can't resist doing it now, and but
right.
it's not like a joke to him. He's taking it very seriously.
Oh, right. Um, yeah. Why did he call it a scherzo though? Like, I genuinely don't know, because scherzo essentially just means like a musical joke, right? As far as I've understood it.
Well, that's the style, but I think scherzo is also a tempo marking,
Oh
maybe.
yeah, right. I mean, he uses it as the tempo marking, right? But the I guess like what I never really understood was how, I guess, how did that kind of become like the norm in a way, and like what was what was so shocking about that, I guess, that sort of makes it important, if that makes sense.
Well, I would guess it's almost like, I would almost think that just how different it is in its time
Sure.
made it iconic. Like to us now, we hear something like the Fifth Symphony, bum 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 bum, and everybody immediately knows what that is, even if they're not students of classical music,
Right.
or if they even consider themselves like, oh, I hate classical music. They still even know what that is
Yeah,
because
right,
it's
right,
just so permeated everything in our society.
right.
Um, and so like I almost think of it like I, I sometimes like kind of like joke with myself when I think about things, and I'm like, I wonder if like the premiere of the Fifth Symphony was almost like oh, and I can't believe like Kanye West,
Well, yeah, right,
like dropping
right.
what was his most recent thing? I can't remember the name of it, but it was
I couldn't tell you.
very religious, right? And it
Right.
was like boom. And now Life of Pablo had a little bit of that in it too,
Sure.
but it was like all over the place and nobody even knew what to think of that, right?
Yeah, right, right. Was
And
Life of Pablo, was that the one where Vox did like this sort of breakdown analysis of one of his like albums or something? Was it
they
Life of Pablo? I
they
don't know
may
if you,
have. Um,
because like they did this basically form analysis of a bunch of Kanye West songs, and like no, it started off with like early Kanye versus contemporary Kanye at that time, and it was like the changes in form were like massive. Because like by the time the Vox was making that documentary, Kanye was releasing like these 12-minute songs, which ironically enough is like that's like a death sentence almost in the world of pop music, right? To have like a 12-minute song, like,
right,
because that's not a radio friendly song.
right, yeah. Um, yeah, so it was Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. I just found it.
Okay, the Sixth
Um,
Symphony. That is that the pastoral?
I believe so. It's programmatic. Yeah.
Yeah. Did
Um,
did Beethoven include that program? Was that Beethoven's idea, or was it a publisher after the fact?
oh goodness, I'm not sure.
I'm gonna look that up. Actually, I'm
Yeah,
I'm
that
curious.
would be a good thing to look up.
Yeah, because I know like in in the next era to come, actually, uh, Schubert's publisher prescribes a lot of stories to his songs that Schubert never actually wanted. It's sort of like after Schubert's death, his publisher just collects a bunch of his songs and says, "This is the Schwannegensson cycle." It's
Right.
like, okay, great.
So I think
Yeah.
from our discussion, the thing that your students can glean from this is that notice like how in depth and like one by one we have to take Beethoven's works, whereas with Haydn we were
Right.
like, yeah, they're all the same, right?
Even to
So
an
like
extent, Mozart, right? It's like Mozart is the same way in a way. It's
yeah, yeah. So it's like the reason we have to do that is because what Beethoven does with the symphony is he elevates it, right, and he
right,
takes it to the next. Each time he writes a new one, he wants to take it to the next level and the
and
next
not
level and the
not
next
just
level.
his symphonies. It's like every work that Beethoven does, even
Yeah,
from like his earliest piano sonatas. It's like the next one had to be different. It had to be greater than the last one. And then you get the eighth one, right? That's the Pathétique, I think, number 8, I think. That's
yes,
the symphony or sonata in C minor. I remember that. But
yeah,
like, that I can't even imagine being in the room where that was premiered, right? And just not having any idea what's about to happen, and like as a listener, just not even being able to follow along with what's going on, right? Because it's so radical for its time.
right,
Anyway,
exactly.
so I, as much as I would love to continue like this discussion, I do think that we need to kind of cut it here. Reese, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. I really would like to do this again in the future, but that's dependent on schedules and timing and whatnot. But
And
Reese, again,
technology.
yeah, right, and technology. I know this would have been a much more in-depth conversation had my things worked earlier. So again, I apologize for that. Sorry. Um, anyway, I that's all I got. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, just let me know. Um,
Yeah, man.
you know, one of the I think one of the things that we can all just keep in mind during this time is like, yeah, we're kind of like limited physically as to where we can move, but we do have,
Yeah,
technologies such as Zoom and Facebook Live, and we kind of in a way have an opportunity kind of forced upon us to
I agree.
do
Actually,
new things and try new things.
yeah,
And unfortunately for our current college students, there's a grade mixed up in that too.
I know. It's
So just
yeah,
my message to your students is just hang in there, do the best you can. We're all going to
right.
get through it together.
And please bear with everyone. Like even your teachers are being forced to try something new right now. So this is a massive learning curve for literally everyone right now. So with that being said, I appreciate your time, Reese, so much. Um, and I hope that you had fun listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nathan.